In Focus continues for you now. Newsroom Africa, Channel 405. Former colonial ruler Belgium will return the last remains of Congo independence leader Patrice Lumumba to his family 60 years after his assassination. The handover ceremony is set to launch a period of official mourning. Joining me now to talk about the significance of this move is law professor, advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation in Kenya, Professor Patrice Lumumba. Prof, good evening and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Is this the type of justice that the family has been asking for?
You know, you must understand that Europe is going through a season of atonement. And when I talk about a season of atonement, before I come back to Patrice Emery Lumumba's remains, the Germans are apologizing for the genocide of the Herero and the Nama. The French are apologizing for their role in the genocide in Rwanda. And the Belgians, rather belatedly, are saying they'll return what remained of Patrice Emery Lumumba. Those of you who read history will remember the book that was written by Ludo de Witt, The Assassination of Lumumba, and what the Belgians and the Americans did. And this cannot be justice. The Lumumba family must be waiting for a complete disclosure of what happened in those days when Patrice was taken out of what is now known as Kinshasa and taken to Katanga. The joint activities of Mobutu Sese Seko and Moise Tshombe, and of course, aided by the Americans and the Belgians. This cannot be justice. This is tokenism at its epitome.
Now, we now know that he was killed on the 17th of January in 1961 by separatists and Belgian mercenaries after the Declaration of Independence. And you also mentioned that the United States, Washington, was also involved. What else do we know about this plan, how it was carved, and how it was carried out?
You know, it is known, and I think that the world now knows, that even before Patrice was eliminated, he had a code name, Satan. And Mobutu Sese Seko had been recruited by the CIA. Joseph Kasavubu, of course, was naive and was complicit in this entire enterprise. Moses Tshombe had been recruited, and the agitation in Katanga, which was designed to ensure that Congo did not know peace after independence, had already been recruited. And what happened, of course, is that Patrice Emery Lumumba was the most convicted, the most charismatic, the most eloquent, the most passionate leader of the day. And when on that day of independence, without being programmed to speak, he rose up and spoke out of the script, he was a marked man. The mark of Cain was placed upon his forehead, and he was to be eliminated by hook or crook. And to achieve this, they recruited his fellow Congolese. In the forefront was Joseph Desire Mobutu, later to be known as Mobutu Sese Seko, and as I've said, Moise Tshombe, and of course Joseph Kasavubu. But these were mere puppets. The puppeteers sat in Brussels and in Washington, D.C.
Up until this point, of course, it has been presented as if it were those Congolese who killed their own brother, and the names that you have just mentioned now. How does this repositioning by Europe need to be interpreted and reflected upon in the context of that lie that has been perpetuated for so long?
Look, my brother, this lie has already been uncovered. There is a book which I commend to everybody to read, the book by Ludo de Vet, The Assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba. And what Ludo de Vet does is to expose how the conspiracy was hatched. And he demonstrates through evidence which is incontrovertible that Patrice was a victim of imperial conspiracy. And when one talks about imperial, one talks about what happened in what was essentially post-Cold War, as historians and political scientists would want to christen it. That Patrice was seen as gravitating towards the West, and the West at that time, or rather toward the East, and the East at that time meant gravitating toward the Soviet Union and therefore towards communism. And this was something that was anathemic to the dominant theme in Africa, which was led by the United States of America. And the United States of America at that time was subterranean and subtle in her operations. So what they did was to go through the erstwhile colonizer, who are the Belgians. And the Belgians too were subtle and subterranean. They recruited Congolese, Aboriginal Congolese, and in the forefront were people who were close to Patrice Emery Lumumba and Mobutu was, and those who hated Lumumba, as Moise Tshombe did. And therefore, the entire enterprise was conducted in a manner that was designed to say that this was Africans killing Africans. But we now know better, because there is evidence which, as I've said, cannot be contradicted, which demonstrates that indeed Patrice Emery was a victim of Western conspiracy and diabolical machinations.
Is there evidence to support this now atonement that Europe seemingly seeks is actually a genuine asking for forgiveness? But not only that, that this is something that emanates from their own countries. They're not just rushing to Africa to offer a fake apology while the policies of segregation remain in their own countries. But not only that, are they not just merely rushing to Africa in order to prevent, the East from using this history against them, because these are things that are becoming a reality and are coming to the fore, and people are beginning to see these truths?
But let's look at it. Patrice Emery Lumumba, if you give me a little latitude, was not the only victim of these diabolical Western machinations. Every African leader who was thinking about Africa and thinking about the plight of Africa was victimized by the Western conspiracies. That included Kwame Nkrumah, that included Modibo Keita, that included Sylvanus Olympio, that included Ahmed Ben Bella, that included individuals such as Nnamdi Azikiwe. It included quite a number of people even beyond that time, the mutinies against Nyerere, against Obote, and everybody else. The West was quite clear that after African countries had regained their independence, they were going to continue the neo-colonial project. And anybody who was clear in their minds that the neo-colonial project would not be allowed to take root was targeted for elimination. And this is still continuing. You see it as recently as 1987 with the elimination of individuals such as Thomas Sankara. So when we talk about the Lumumbas of this world, we must remember that they were emblematic of a new breed of Africans. Africans who believe that in order to regain our independence and our dignity, the umbilical cord that connected us with the erstwhile colonizers had to be cut. And when they spoke boldly, eloquently, and fearlessly, they were designed for one thing in the minds of the colonizer: elimination. And there was no shortage of individuals within the ranks of Africans who were ready to be recruited for 30 pieces of silver to eliminate their very own. And I've said, and I'm saying it almost ad nauseum, that in Congo, it included people like Mobutu Sese Seko, then known as Joseph Desire Mobutu, and Moise Chombe, among others, with a very compliant and a very placid Joseph Kasavubu, who knew not what was happening, or even if he knew, cared not.
We continue with you here on In Focus, the symbolic dismemberment of Patrice Lumumba's body and how that relates to the fate of Congo itself in terms of resources, people, good soils, plentiful rainforest, minerals including gold, copper, and so forth. We'll talk to those issues with Professor PLO in a moment. Stay with us. With you here on In Focus, Newsroom Africa, channel 405, and we are with law professor, advocate of the High Courts of Kenya, and founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation in Kenya, Professor Patrice Lumumba. Before the break, he was recounting, of course, the relationship between what the Europeans did in Congo and what they did elsewhere on the African continent. Now, Prof, I don't know if you can hear us and whether we have lost connection with you, but what I wanted us to touch on as we return, the ceremonial dismemberment of the body of Patrice Lumumba, symbolic, of course, of the fate that Congo itself then suffered in terms of resources, people, the soil, the rain, the forest, the minerals, including gold, coltan, copper, cobalt, diamonds, and uranium, and why just returning these two front teeth cannot be seen as enough.
A disunited Congo is an open field for Western parasites. It is only in her disunity that Congo remains as a ground, a hunting ground for Europeans. What with uranium, with cobalt, with coltan, with copper, and with gold. And those who know that the busiest place for aircrafts in Africa is Eastern Congo. Keep them disunited and keep them in a state of panic, then you can exploit them. And until the day that the spirit of Patrice Emery Lumumba is quietened, Congo will never be addressed. It is in the interest of Belgians and is the interest of parasitic Western countries and individuals that Congo remains disunited. The tragedy is that there are Africans who are complicit in this regard. Successive African leaders in Congo have allowed themselves to be puppets, to be manipulated and controlled from Brussels, from Paris, from Washington, D.C., from London and other Western capitals for the purpose, and lately even from Beijing, for purposes of acquisition of the resources of Congo to the detriment of the people of Congo. And that is why I say, and I repeat it now, that if Congo is to be saved, it must take the continent of Africa to take charge of our affairs and to remind the world, and not just by word, but by word and deed, that African resources are there to be exploited for the benefit of the people of Africa. Easier said than done, but it starts with being said, and it starts with crusades, so that even a news agency such as yours should not just treat the engagement with me as an episodic engagement, but should see it as the beginning of a crusade, and that you should take a solemn vow that going forward, you are going to ensure that this agenda remains alive at all times. I hope you will.
Certainly, certainly, and that's exactly what we seek to do, and we will continue to do so. And Prof, let's talk then about the processes that will unfold in Congo now, as far as the funerals that are going to be held, but also the grave that is going to be erected. Now, the colonists didn't want graves to be a shrine. Actually, that's why they opted to burn these remains with acid, and only took these two teeth, and they left them in a trophy. How significant is what is about to happen now in as far as actually having a grave erected?
It is as significant as the Congolese government under President Tshisekedi will make it. First of all, if I was asked what they should do symbolically, is that the mortal remains of Patrice Emery Lumumba should be taken around Congo for no less than 1 month, with a clear message, a message that is reminiscent of what Patrice Emery Lumumba said on that day of independence, that Congo is now free, and our freedom is going to be written by our sons and daughters. I hope, therefore, that when the mortal remains of Patrice Emery Lumumba are taken to Kinshasa for 1 month, those remains will go around the Democratic Republic of Congo in every village and every hamlet to the extent that is humanly possible, in order to remind the Congolese who only know Patrice Emery as a figure of history, so that that spirit of self-esteem is reawakened. And when ultimately it returns to Kinshasa, there'll be a shrine which will form a home of pilgrimage for those who believe that Congo must be free. And I hope that when that happens, in a unique and a divine way, Congo will never be the same again. I hope and pray.
A quote here from one of the Belgian kings who says, "No Congolese will ever forget that independence was won in struggle, a persevering and inspired struggle carried on from day to day, a struggle in which we were undaunted by privation or suffering and stinted neither strength nor blood. It was filled with tears, fire, and blood. We are deeply proud of our struggle because it was just and noble and indispensable in putting an end to the humiliation, bondage forced upon us." I mean, these were words of Lumumba actually telling an audience, including a Belgian king at the
King
time.
Baudouin.
Yeah. And these are important words. Yeah.
He said, "I prefer to die with my head high above, with indestructible faith and profound belief in the destiny of my country, than to live in humility and renounce the principles which I consider sacred to me." Patrice was a visionary. Patrice was fearless. Patrice, even those who shot him and dismembered his body, said that unlike anybody else, he showed no fear. He said, and read his last letter to his wife, Josephine Opango, in which he says, among other things, "I'm incarcerated. I know that I'm going to die, but I die in joy, knowing as I do that the history of Congo will never be the same." That is the man about whom we talk, Patrice Emery Lumumba.
Many are saying the return of his remains will bring about historical relief. But again, some sense says the scars will never be forgotten.
I hope that the African Union, not just Congo, but the African Union will see this as a significant development in the history of Africa. As I said at the very beginning, there is a sense in which there is a spirit of atonement in the entire continent of Europe. Patrice Emery Lumumba's return through his mortal remains is not only symbolic but emblematic of that season of atonement.
Let's talk to some of the WhatsApp messages then that have come through, Prof, tonight. Many of those who are watching as well saying contracts and agreements entered between all European nations and African countries more than 100 years ago should be now declared null and void as they are inhumane. Your reflection and just comments on that.
You know, whatever agreement it is that was entered into, whatever agreements they are that were entered into, hold and should hold no value. I know what the French did in 1948. I know what the British did, what the Portuguese did, what they did. Those should now be declared historically irrelevant. And Africa should chart her own course, not to remain apart from the world, but to reassert her dignity as a people. And I hope that through the agency of the African Union, and if not the African Union, through the agency of men and women such as you and I, we will be there in the forefront raising our voices, even if they are not heard at their most eloquent, making demands and demanding that we must do what is in the best interest of Africa. You have suffered for too long. You have been humiliated for too long. You have been abused for too long.
Here's another message on WhatsApp tonight, and this one says, last remains of Patrice Lumumba should indeed be returned in order for the family to find peace. But all minerals stolen from Africa must also be returned. And that links up to the question that I asked earlier on, that this repositioning by Europe on the continent, is it not part of another scramble for the resources of the continent?
If we are not very careful, the Europeans are very diabolical. At least the European politicians are very diabolical. Let us be very careful that this may yet be another Trojan horse, which they are using to lull us into a false sense of security. But this time round, I think we are wiser than that. This time round, they are not going to catch us unawares. This time round, we are too careful for them. But let us remember that throughout the ages, they have manipulated the African sense of dignity and African kindness. This time round, let us not close our eyes in prayer to find our land and our minerals taken. Let us pray with our eyes open, and let us guard that which is our own. It is our duty, our solemn duty, our patriotic duty to do so.
Prof, we appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Law Professor, Advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation in Kenya, Professor Patrick Lumumba. Of course, we continue with that commitment, Prof. Indeed, we will get back to that story and ensure that it stays on the public discourse and continues to be a point in which we rally and have a conversation. An update of what's making news here on Newsroom Africa Channel 405 when we return. But also we have a conversation with Terry Nzau. It looks like Kenya has extended its COVID-19 curfew for another 60 days. We've got the details for you when we continue. Stay with us.